Did you know that Gigi Hadid is a refugee? Yes, the LA native, multi-millionaire American model is a Palestinian refugee despite never living anywhere near the Middle East. Absurd, right? The reason for that is UNRWA. Now, we have been talking about UNRWA all week, so in case you missed, many countries around the world have stopped giving money to UNRWA as it was discovered that many UNRWA employees celebrated and even took active part in the October 7th massacre. And in general, UNRWA textbooks are filled with hate, violence and calls for terror. Turns out UNRWA is not much of a UN branch, but more of a Hamas branch. But even if you put all that aside, there is still a huge problem with UNRWA. You see, UNRWA is the UN agency that deals with Palestinian refugees. But the UN already has a refugee agency, the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It deals with all refugees around the world except for Palestinians who have UNRWA, another agency just for them. Why do Palestinians deserve a special agency? Nobody knows. Do Palestinian refugees deserve more than the 2.6 million who were forced to flee Sudan last year? Well, according to the UN, the answer is yes. See, despite serving 13 times more refugees, the UNHCR has half the number of staff members, and money-wise, it gives half for each refugee compared to UNRWA. And you know what is the best thing about the UNHCR? It is shrinking. That's good, think about it. The UN has decided that being a refugee is a bad thing. We don't want people to be refugees, we want them to find a home. If they were forced to leave their country, we want them to gain citizenship elsewhere. And that's what the UNHCR is doing. It makes sure its refugees stop being refugees. That's why it's shrinking. The UNHCR helped 22,000 refugees gain citizenship in 2020 alone. That is amazing. That is their purpose. But for UNRWA, it's the other way around. It started with 700,000 refugees and it now stands at 5.6 million. It actually expands. And do you know why? Well, first of all, since forming in 1949, UNRWA has yet to resettle a single refugee. Not a single one. And second of all, UNRWA invented a new definition for its refugees. Under UNRWA, unlike any other refugee around the world, the refugee status is carried out to next generations. Meaning that if your grandfather left Israel in 1948 and settled in Jordan, where you and your parents were born and gained citizenship and full rights, both you and your parents are still considered Palestinian refugees under UNRWA. That's how Gigi Hadid became a multi-millionaire refugee. That's how the number of Palestinian refugees keeps growing, even though millions of them actually have another citizenship. Are you beginning to understand the absurdity of UNRWA? When the goal of all refugees is to stop being refugees, UNRWA does everything in its power to make sure its refugees stay refugees. Not only that, it wants more and more refugees, because that is how UNRWA gets paid. UNRWA is the largest employer of Palestinians. If they stop being refugees, they will stop needing UNRWA. And UNRWA wants to be needed. That is how it gets paid, and it gets paid a lot. In conclusion, UNRWA has a huge incentive to preserve refugee status. And to be honest, that is the opposite of what we expect from a refugee agency. And do you want to know what UNRWA says about all this? They say that all Palestinians have a right to return to Israel, to all of Israel, even if they never lived there. You see, according to UNRWA, Gigi Hadid has a right to my home in Tel Aviv, despite the fact that neither she, nor her parents, nor her Dutch grandmother ever lived there. And according to UNRWA, until that happens, until Israel is completely emptied of all Jews, until then, all the Palestinians who live in Gaza or the West Bank should not strive to get a new citizenship and rights, but to stay miserable and dependent on UNRWA. So basically, UNRWA's entire existence is based on the premise that Israel should not exist. That's why it teaches every Palestinian kid to hate Jews and to long for martyrdom. That's why it recruits teachers who have connections to Hamas ISIS. That's why it doesn't help its refugees, not a single one of them. Folks, UNRWA is not really a refugee agency. It's a political movement with very strong ties to terrorist organizations. UNRWA is the opposite of what we need. It's the opposite of what Palestinians need. It's time to put a stop to this absurdity. It's time to defund UNRWA.